Last Christmas, my son-in-law Derek looked me right in the eye and said, "Frank, when are you going to stop being a broke old man and get a real job? Sarah deserves better than having a father who embarrasses her." What Derek didn't know was that the broke old man he was talking to owned the company where he worked in, was about to become his new boss. For 3 years, I'd watched this arrogant kid treat me like garbage while he lived off credit cards and borrowed money. But that Christmas comment was the last straw. This is the story of how one cruel comment at a family dinner revealed who the real broke person was and cost Derek everything he thought he'd earned.
My name is Frank Morrison, and for most of my life, people have looked at me and seen exactly what I wanted them to see: a simple working man who never amounted to much. I started working at Peterson Manufacturing when I was 18, straight out of high school on the factory floor. My wife Martha and I lived paycheck to paycheck for the first few years of our marriage. But Martha was smart with money, and she taught me something important. "Frank," she'd say, "rich people don't look rich. They look smart." So while other guys spent their paychecks on new trucks and bar tabs, I started investing. Small amounts at first, $20 here, $50 there. I bought stock in the companies that supplied our factory. I invested in real estate when nobody wanted it. I learned to read financial statements during my lunch breaks. When Martha got sick 15 years ago, I had to make a choice. I could keep working the factory job with good insurance, or I could risk everything on the business investments I'd been building on the side. Martha told me, "Frank, you've been preparing for this moment your whole life. It's time to bet on yourself." So I did. I used my savings to buy my first company, a small parts supplier that was going bankrupt. I kept my factory job during the day and ran the business at night. Within 2 years, I turned it profitable and bought 2 more companies. By the time Martha passed away 5 years ago, I owned 17 companies across 3 states. But I still lived in the same modest house, drove the same old truck, and wore the same work clothes. To the outside world, I was just Frank Morrison, the factory worker. People have looked at me all my life and seen exactly what I preferred they see: a man with calloused hands, a steady gait, and a lunch pail that smelled of coffee and cold roast beef. That image served me well. It kept the talkers talking and the doers close. It let me listen more than I spoke and learn more than anyone expected. I walked into Peterson Manufacturing at 18 and thought I'd be lucky to hold a steady job for a few years. The factory floor taught me rhythms, steel on steel, the hum of conveyors, the shift whistle that could turn a noisy room into a migration of boots. I learned how to fix a jam before the supervisor noticed, how to read a machine's mood by vibration alone, and how to keep a crew moving without barking orders. At lunch, while the guys argued over ball games, I opened newspapers to the business pages and traced unfamiliar words with a stub pencil. Price-to-earnings ratios, dividends. Debt service mysteries at first, then tools. Money was thin in those early years, but discipline was thick. A few dollars went to a low-fee index fund, a few more to a supplier's stock when I recognized their components on our line, and every windfall over time, holiday pay, tool allowance leftovers, found its way into something that grew on its own. I filed the paperwork myself, made mistakes, corrected them, and set up a shoebox system that would eventually become a filing cabinet and, later, a room. I met Martha during a double shift when the water fountain broke and someone offered her a warm soda out of a vending machine. She laughed, shared half with me, and I decided then that this was a person who measured life in meaning, not display. We married, counted grocery by the ounce, patched jeans, and kept envelopes in a kitchen drawer labeled with bills and goals. She had a knack for turning thrift into an art form, never miserly, always intentional. She reminded me without drama that wealth likes quiet, not spotlights. Together we built habits that would outlive us both. When Sarah was born, The factory's rumble turned into a metronome for purpose. I took on the graveyard shift to be home during the day, learned to nap in 20-minute slices, and carried a paperback about accounting in my back pocket. We set aside $20 a week for a future we couldn't yet name. On Sundays, I took Sarah to hardware stores and auctions, teaching her to price a thing by its usefulness, not its shine. At night, when the house settled and the baseboard heater ticked, I spread annual reports across the kitchen table and underlined numbers while Martha sketched next month's budget in a spiral notebook. Side work showed up the way opportunity always does, dressed in overalls. A supervisor mentioned a shuttered parts supplier a few towns over that owed money and had inventory collecting dust. I drove out, walked the floor with the owner, and saw value everywhere the brokers saw junk. A good forklift, pallet racks still, square, a customer list with 2 names I recognized from our line. I couldn't afford the whole thing, but I could afford the accounts, the racks, and a corner of the lease if the landlord would listen. He did. I delivered orders out of my pickup for 6 months, learned more about receivables than I ever wanted to know, and inch by inch turned a dying operation into a living one. One deal led to another. A machinist shop with an owner ready to retire but worried about his crew. A packaging company with reliable contracts and a leaky roof. A small logistics outfit that ran on relationships instead of software. I built a set of rules and followed them without romance. By boring, by where the people are better than the paperwork, by only what cash flow can carry, and never strip the copper. The quickest dollar is the most expensive mistake. When a business came under my care, the first checks went to payroll and vendors, the next to maintenance and safety, and only then to my pocket. Word traveled the quiet channels, the back table at diners, the bench outside the parts counter that the tall guy in work boots paid on time and didn't make promises he couldn't keep. James Peterson came into the picture when the file folders outgrew the closet. He was the sort of attorney who returned calls and read everything twice. We laid out a structure of holding companies and operating companies, clean ledgers between them, independent audits, and a moat of boring compliance. That kept the empire invisible and safe. Anonymity wasn't a game. It was a strategy. A modest truck, an old watch, a house that never made the neighborhood editorials. These were shields in a world that confuses loud with strong. Martha's illness read through every line. Hospital corridors have their own clocks. Time stretches and snaps back, and the smallest kindness becomes a landmark. I kept my day job longer than anyone thought sensible because the insurance mattered. Then handed in my badge when the businesses could carry. U.S. I signed term sheets in waiting rooms and memorized lab results in the glow of vending machines. Martha asked if we were going to be all right, and I told her the truth. We already were, because she had taught me to build on bedrock. After she passed, the silence in the house felt like an ocean. Work turned into a rope I could hold. Grief sharpened my eyesight. I became even more deliberate. One favored companies with second-generation owners who wanted dignity for their parents' work, not a victory lap. I kept founders on as paid advisors when their knowledge was priceless and moved quietly when it wasn't. I learned that a plant that smells like solvent at 6 a.m. tells you more than a spreadsheet that smells like cologne at noon. Everywhere I bought, I preserved the sign out front. The sponsorship banner at the Little League field. The Christmas bonuses in December. If a break room had a bulletin board with baby photos and softball schedules, I knew I was in a place worth saving. Sarah grew into those habits without ever being asked. She chose teaching, a career that multiplies value without printing it on a paycheck. I covered her student loan gaps anonymously through a small scholarship in her district, and she never asked why the interest stopped accruing so fast. We had Saturday breakfast that turned into budgeting lessons and conversations about kindness. When she brought home report cards from students who had learned to love reading, I felt richer than any quarterly statement could make me. I stayed on friendly terms with the factory long after I left the payroll. I knew the names of the operators on each line, which punch press ran hot, which coolant pump needed a nudge to prime. When a shift leader retired, I attended the steakhouse send-off and picked up the tab without signing it in a way anyone would. Notice, I preferred the loading dock to the boardroom, the smell of cutting oil to the smell of fresh paint in a new office. The portfolio grew into a quiet forest. 17 companies became a number I stopped saying out loud. Some years were all pruning and no fruit. Others surprised me with a harvest I hadn't dared plan for. I made mistakes, paid for them, and included the lessons in a binder labeled notes. I kept my promises, even when contracts would have let me wiggle out. I funded safety upgrades in plants I didn't yet own, then earned the sale because trust is the rarest currency in business and the only one I care to hoard. There were small mercies I never announced. A foreman's wife needed surgery. An envelope appeared with a note from the company's emergency fund. A scholarship showed up at the high school awards night, named for a janitor who had retired after 40 years. A church roof got repaired by a contractor who owed me nothing and sent me the bill anyway. I overpaid it and told him to give the difference to the youth program. Quiet hands, quiet work. I kept a ledger of personal rules taped inside the cabinet, where we used to stack cereal. Never let your mouth write checks your character can't cash. Never confuse a title with authority. Real authority is lent by the people you serve. Never compete with a show-off. Step aside and let him find the cliff himself. Never teach a braggart with words. Teach him with outcomes. As the years moved, the gap between who I was and what people assumed widened in my favor. Neighbors waved and asked if I was still putting in hours at the plant. I nodded and asked about their kids. On the rare occasion someone pressed, I told them work was good, which was always true. The truck got new tires when it needed them, not a moment sooner. The watch kept time. The boots got resoled and returned to service. It felt like freedom to owe no one an explanation. I knew, of course, that Sarah would eventually bring someone home who spoke a language different from ours. Ambition isn't a sin. It's just a tool that can be used to build or to posture. I hoped for a man who used it like a hammer, not a megaphone. Before I met him, I prayed for patience in myself and discernment in her. I promised to listen more than I spoke, to refrain from measuring him by the gloss of his shoes, and to let time do what it does best, reveal character in layers. By then, the businesses had professional managers, incentive plans tied to real metrics, and auditors who could scare the laziness out of any ledger. James handled the legal guardrails, and I handled the culture. We rewarded the person who stayed late to help a teammate, not the one who stayed late to be seen. We trained supervisors to recognize quiet competence. We built promotion tracks that didn't require a loud voice, only a trustworthy one. The house stayed the same, though I replaced the furnace and roof when they needed it. The same kitchen table held new ledgers. The same coffee mug warmed my hands when the sun came up and paperwork spread. On the wall, a photo of Martha during a picnic reminded me that love is the only compound interest that never reverses. In the garage, a workbench waited for small repairs that steadied my mind when deals were big and days were loud. Eventually, the path I had been walking in boots met a path paved in imported leather. A young man with a perfect smile and loud cufflinks entered my daughter's life. Before naming him, I watched. Before concluding, I listened. My job in the setup of this story wasn't to change him or to rescue her. My job was to keep building on bedrock, to stay true to the discipline that brought us here, and to be ready patiently, quietly for whatever the truth would require when it finally showed itself. Sarah met Derek 4 years ago at a business conference where she was presenting on behalf of her school district. He was everything I wasn't college educated, smooth talking, wore expensive suits, drove a BMW. Sarah was smitten. Derek had an MBA from Northwestern and worked as a regional sales director for Hamilton Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing company. He made good money, around $120,000 a year, and he made sure everyone knew it. From the moment I met Derek, I could tell he looked down on me. He'd make little comments about my blue-collar background and suggest that Sarah deserved to marry up from her family's economic status. At their engagement dinner, Derek actually said to me, "Don't worry, Frank. Once Sarah and I are married, you won't have to worry about money anymore. I'll take care of her the way she deserves," as if I hadn't been taking care of my daughter perfectly well for 30 years. But I bit my tongue. Sarah was happy, and that's all that mattered to me. I figured Derek would mature once. He realized that respect isn't about how much money you make. It's about how you treat people. I paid for their entire wedding $45,000 without telling Derek where the money came from. I told Sarah it was Martha's life insurance money, which was technically true, though it was only a small fraction of what Martha had actually left me. Derek never thanked me for the wedding. He just assumed that Sarah's poor old dad had gone into debt to give his daughter a nice day. He had no idea that $45,000 was what I made in interest every month. Sarah met him at a district leadership conference held in one of those downtown hotels where the carpets swallow footsteps and every hallway smells faintly of lemon polish. She went to present a case study on stretching a school budget. He was there to sell software licenses and shake hands. He saw a room full of prospects. She saw a hallway of exhausted teachers. Somehow they ended up at the same table during a breakout, where he asked carefully curated questions and laughed at all the right times. He knew exactly how to flatter without seeming obvious, just enough to make a person feel recognized. By the end of the afternoon, he had a coffee in one hand, a business card in the other, and an invitation to a Saturday volunteer event she'd organized for her student's dot. He showed up in crisp weekend casual pressed chinos, a watch that sparkled whenever the sun came through the gym windows. He didn't lift as much as the other dads who carried book boxes from the warehouse to the school library, but he carried them noisily and talked about the importance of literacy while he did it. He learned the names of 2 kids and repeated them often, smiling the way men do when they want you to remember how good they look doing a good thing. He kept checking his phone like he was putting out small fires. Later, he raved about the community impact as if he'd been integral to it all along. My daughter called me that night floating, buoyed by the idea that someone saw the world the way she did. I listened and told her I was glad. You can be glad and wary at the same time. First time he came by the house, he brought a bottle of wine with a label meant to be noticed. He angled it toward the light as if it needed its picture taken. He complimented the woodworking on the porch rail, then added that he preferred clean, modern lines, glass, steel, minimal. He liked to say minimal, as if fewer things were proof of better taste. He asked about my truck, how many miles, how often I changed the oil. He listened with a grin that said he already knew the answer. Too many, too often. I asked about his work. Regional sales director. Travel, dinners, quotas. He enjoyed winning, he said. He enjoyed the hunt. There are men who hunt for food, and men who hunt for trophies. It usually takes time to learn which is which. With him, it didn't doubt at Sunday dinner, he took charge of conversation the way people do who've practiced in mirrors. He had opinions on the restaurant industry, higher education, municipal bonds. He talked about asset classes like they were action figures from a childhood he couldn't wait to outgrow. He asked me what I did, and I said I kept busy. He took that as an invitation to be helpful. Have you thought about annuitizing? He asked. There are products designed for folks at your stage. Folks at your stage. I tucked the phrase away beside the others. He didn't know he was giving me dot when he and Sarah got serious. His invitations became more specific. Charity gala. He could get us a deal on tickets because he knew the board chair. Golf tournament his company sponsored a hole. He always had a reason things were cheaper for him, though nothing in his life suggested the word thrift. Sarah wore a soft blue dress to one event, and he mentioned, casually, that a different cut would photograph better. He meant well, he said. It was about angles and lines. He liked angles and lines that looked good on him. I watched her tuck that comment somewhere quiet and promised myself. I'd remember where she put it. He liked to talk about leadership. Leadership at scale, leadership under pressure, leadership that moved the needle. He used phrases that belonged on posters in airport lounges. When he shook hands with men older than him, he squeezed a little too long to show he was strong. When he shook hands with the women from the district office, he softened and promised to follow up with a deck. He promised a lot of decks. Promising is easy when your calendar is a ladder you believe will always keep lengthening in front of you. The first red flag, at least the first one I wrote down, came during a minor emergency at the condo he shared with a roommate before the engagement. A leak from the unit above had soaked his area rug. He called me, exasperated, because the building manager was taking too long. Could I recommend a tradesman who wouldn't overcharge? I gave him a name. He balked at the rate, lectured the contractor about margins, and then posted a photo of himself later that night at a rooftop bar with the caption, "Crisis averted, efficiency wins again." The rug was still damp in the background of the selfie. Efficiency, like minimal, is a word people use when they want you to ignore how many corners they're cutting. Engagement arrived on a weekday evening with a glittering ring and a dinner reservation he'd mentioned 3 times before dessert. He made a toast to partnership and growth. I made a toast to health, which is what you toast when you don't want to talk about money at a table full of strangers. Afterward, while Sarah hugged friends on the sidewalk, he leaned in and asked if I planned to contribute to the wedding. He phrased it politely, as if doing me a favor by bringing it up early. "Weddings are expensive," he said, "and educators don't make what they're worth." He was including Sarah in a problem he had already solved in his mind. I said we'd make sure the day was what it needed to be, then went home and dug out a file Martha had labeled years ago for joy. She always thought ahead where celebrations were concerned. He prided himself on being a reader. He left books conspicuously on coffee tables, biographies of CEOs, dog-eared at the chapters about turnarounds and exits. He recommended podcasts about edge, hustle, unfair advantages. He laughed at the idea of luck and called it timing, which is what men call luck when they want to keep it. He told stories about clients who became friends and friends who became clients. The line between the two was thin enough to trip over. He liked to test boundaries with people who served him. He'd chatter on his phone while the barista waited for his order, then complain if the milk phone wasn't right. He posted a photo of a valet ticket and wrote, "Supporting the local economy." In his world, every interaction was a chance to audition as the lead. Supporting looks a lot like starring when you're the one holding the camera. He met my oldest friend at a fish fry and tried to negotiate the price of a quart of slaw down $1. She smiled and said the price was posted. He turned to me, grin polished, and said, "You can always ask." He's right. You can always ask. People tell you who they are in the smallest exchanges. Listen there. When the talk turned to where they would live, he suggested neighborhoods with gates and names that sounded like bottled water. Sarah said she loved her little apartment near the school. She could walk to work and wave at her students. Parents on the corner. He said the HOA would be better for resale. He was not wrong. He was also not listening. I took him to my workshop one afternoon, the place I still go when the world gets loud. He stood in the doorway, careful not to get dust on those loafers. He complimented the joinery on a table I'd been building and asked what I charged for pieces like that. I told him I didn't sell most of them. He paused, puzzled. "If it doesn't scale," he said, "what's the point?" "The point is the thing," I said. He tilted his head like I'd answered in a language he hadn't chosen to learn. There's a rhythm to courtship that involves small favors. He asked to borrow my truck for a weekend move. He returned it with a full tank and a new phone charger, tangled around the gear shift, as if the gift of something inexpensive could distract from the scratches on the tailgate. He borrowed a ladder and left it in the rain, then insisted it was treated wood and wouldn't matter. He'd borrowed a drill and lost the battery. When I mentioned it, he laughed and promised to replace it with a better one once his bonus cleared. Promises are ladders too. They look sturdy until you put your weight on the next rung. He often referenced his mentors, a managing director who taught him to identify the decision maker in any room, a professor who said perception is reality, a podcast host who reminded him that money flows to confidence. He had a rule of 2 compliments for every ask, which made his ask feel like favors he was doing you, an odd trick of light. You don't notice until your eyes adjust. He loved Sarah in the version of love that expects applause. Flowers arrived at her school on ordinary Tuesdays, and he texted her 10 minutes later to ask if the front office ladies were impressed. He booked a weekend away and asked her to post a photo tagging the hotel. She did. She also reminded him gently that her students noticed when she missed Monday mornings. He reminded her that a good life needed rewards. He was not wrong. He was also keeping score in a game he never announced. The more he came around, the more he graded everything. Restaurants, colleagues, even traffic. He gave out A's sparingly and F's freely, and the curve was always bent toward whoever agreed with him last. He sized up my friends by their shoes and my neighbors by their lawns. He had a theory about everything and data for nothing. It is a common modern talent. Before the wedding, he suggested we streamline the guest list. Fewer people would make a stronger statement. He said, quality over quantity. He meant fewer of mine, more of his. He didn't say it, but he didn't have to. I told him the list was Sarah's, and he nodded as if I had confirmed a bias about outdated loyalties. He liked to explain compound interest, which amused me more than it should have. He talked about equity as if the word itself could build a house. He boasted about closing a tough quarter and treated dinner like a shareholder meeting where he could report results. There's another kind of result you track quietly. Who thanks? The person who cooked, who stacks plates without being asked, who notices when the dog's water bowl is low. On those charts, he hovered just above 0. He wore success the way a kid wears his father's coat proud. A little hunched sleeves, swallowing wrists. He seemed sure that every room contained a mirror and that every mirror belonged to him. He believed in destiny in the way of men who have never had a plan fail because someone else locked a door. He believed certain doors simply opened if you pushed. Some of them do. Others are owned. He hadn't learned the difference by the time the engagement dinner rolled around. He had curated a network of people who celebrated him, and he brought them with him wherever he went, at least in conversation. He sprinkled their names like seasoning. He believed seasoning could fix any cut of meat. It can't. He gave me a speech about how fortunate Sarah was to be marrying into opportunity. I cut the roast and passed it down the table and let him mistake my quiet for agreement. It is a kindness to let a man hear his own voice longer than he should. Eventually, he recognizes the echo. I have known a lot of men like him. I have also known which kind of pressure brings out the grain in a person and which kind exposes the veneer. He had polished his veneer until it shone. He hadn't considered what would happen when someone tapped it with a knuckle. When they set a date, he announced a savings plan that involved trimming small luxuries, then leased a newer car to celebrate. He bought a suit that looked expensive in photos and suggested I rent a tux. He wanted uniformity. Uniformity looks best on paper. In real life, authenticity photographs better than fabric. He had an MBA and believed that meant he spoke a dialect. The rest of us should learn. I had a lifetime of ledgers and believed numbers behaved the same no matter who read them. You like to say it's not personal, it's business. I have never found that to be true. Business is very personal. It always has been. All of this to say, by the time December came and the table was set with recipes from a woman who never wasted a word, I had learned him. People like to think they are mysteries. They are patterns. He has shown me his over and over, confident that I couldn't read them. Confidence can be a kind of blindness. The trick is to stand still and keep your eyes open while a man tells you where he thinks the world begins and ends. He thought it began with him and ended with the people who could be useful to him. He thought worth shone from glossy surfaces. He thought respect flowed uphill to money. He thought old men were either burdens or background. He thought a lot of things that evening, right up until the moment he leaned back in his chair, smiled across my table, and asked when I planned to stop being a broke old man. That was the moment the pattern drew itself into a circle. And circles, once closed, have a way of turning into wheels. Wheels eventually roll. Over the next 3 years, Derek's attitude toward me only got worse. He'd make jokes about my simple lifestyle and suggest that I should think about retirement, since I was getting too old for manual labor. The worst part was watching how it affected Sarah. She tried to defend me, but Derek would shut her down with comments like, "Honey, your dad's a good man, but he doesn't understand how the business world works. Some people are meant to be workers, and some are meant to be leaders." Derek loved to show off his lifestyle. The leased BMW, the expensive apartment, the designer clothes. He'd take Sarah on expensive vacations and then complain about HOW. Some people don't understand the value of investing in experiences. What Derek didn't know was that I'd been quietly investigating his financial situation. You don't build a business empire without learning how to research people. And what I discovered about Derek was interesting. Derek was drowning in debt. The BMW was leased at $800 a month. The apartment rent was $3,500 a month. His credit cards were maxed out at over $75,000. He was living paycheck to paycheck while pretending to be wealthy. But the most interesting thing I discovered was where Derek worked. Hamilton Industries, the company where he was so proud. To be a regional sales director was one of the companies I'd been considering acquiring from my portfolio. It started small enough to pass as thoughtless humor, a jab about coupons tucked into the napkin holder on my kitchen table. A smirk when I reached for the old percolator instead of the chrome machine he said could brew a perfect cup in 60 seconds. He had a talent for pointing out the price tag on anything that didn't have one, as if value only became real when you could ring it up at a registered dot at Sunday dinners. He'd arrive late and narrate his day like the closing bell depended on it. Traffic had been brutal. Valet tickets were a racket. The concierge in his building kept mixing up his dry cleaning. He'd slide into the chair at the head of the table as if he'd been assigned it at birth, lean back, and ask if there was a better wine glass than the one in front of him. He liked to comment that some households were stuck in another decade, then grin as if he'd paid me a compliment for preserving history. He graded everything. My truck got a C- for fuel efficiency. My porch furniture earned a D for design. A roast that had nourished this family for 30 years was upgraded to a passing B once he learned the cut had come from a butcher whose name sounded continental. He ran his mouth like a Yelp account with legs. When he and Sarah moved into their first place together, I brought over a set of tools wrapped in a towel hammer, stud finder, level things a home needs before it knows it needs them. He thanked me loudly, posted a picture of the toolbox with a caption about honoring craftsmanship, then called a handyman to hang the first picture because he didn't want to scuff the paint. He asked to borrow my ladder for the weekend and left it in the rain. When I mentioned it, he said treated wood was meant to handle the elements. He wasn't wrong. He was also missing the point. He loved the theater of generosity. At a Father's Day brunch, he waved off the check like a man clearing smoke from a room, then tapped a card that declined quietly. The server handled it with grace. Sarah reached for her purse. I set down enough cash to cover us 3 times over and changed the subject to her student's science fair. He later explained that the card company had tightened policies recently because of fraud, and that he appreciated how I'd stepped in. He called it teamwork. I called it making sure the server didn't eat the bill. He nudged boundaries though. Way, a toddler tests a fence. Could I co-sign a car so he could secure a better rate? Just for a few months until the promotion came through. Could I float them a short-term loan to bridge a bonus that was surely around the corner? Could I introduce him to a banker I trusted? He wanted a private client experience without the private client balance. I smiled, said I had a rule about money and family, and changed the topic to the weather that had been so good for tomatoes. He liked to position his opinions as infrastructure. Retirement planning, he said, required specialized products meant for people at my stage. He could connect me to a guy who could simplify everything into one account with a guaranteed draw. He meant well and expected my gratitude for it. I told him my bills were already on autopilot. He laughed and clapped my shoulder in a gesture that moved me an inch without my permission. The jokes about work arrived with the first cold snap that fall. He wanted to know if I ever thought about slowing down. Men my age had a responsibility to their families, not to get hurt on the job. He meant the job he imagined I still had, the one that matched the flannel on my back. He offered to help me, polish my resume, as if a stranger might rescue me from a life he'd decided I should be ashamed of. I told him I was all set. He said that was the problem. Too many men my age were all set until they weren't. He managed Sarah's calendar, the way a hotel manages occupancy. Weekend visits with me became hard to schedule because there was always a networking dinner, a couples trip, a volunteer gala he suddenly had to MC. When she did make it over, her phone buzzed with reminders he'd left. Don't forget the florist quote. Remember to confirm the dog walker. He was building a life that required her hands and my silence. I practiced both until I could do them in my sleep. He was generous with advice for anyone who couldn't bill him by the hour. When the water heater at my place coughed its last, he offered to source a discount through one of his client relationships, then emailed a quote that was 15% higher than the one I'd already lined up. He said, "You pay for peace of mind." I said I sleep fine either way. He made sport of the old school where Sarah taught. The building was quaint, he said, which was another way of admitting the auditorium didn't have a sound system he could plug his phone into. He advised her to push for a newer campus in a neighborhood with demographics aligned with donors. He meant richer. She reminded him gently that her kids were exactly where she wanted to be. He nodded, then suggested a fundraising campaign that would spotlight thought leaders. He meant himself. Holiday season sharpened his edges. At a Friendsgiving, he toasted to abundance and followed it with a speech about scarcity mindsets that keep people small. He declared himself allergic to scarcity and laughed, asking who wanted seconds as if he'd improved the recipe. Later that night, he leaned across my table and said a man should have the courage to upgrade his environment. He meant my house. He floated the idea of selling, moving me into a sleek senior community with amenities. It would free up capital and solve the inconvenience of his long drive for family dinners. I told him there are some commutes you don't shorten without losing your destination dot. He admired people in direct proportion to their utility. A neighbor who built fences and could get him into a sold-out concert received 2 long handshakes and a flurry of texts afterward. The same neighbor became invisible once the tickets were secured. He told a cousin in accounting that career growth demands strategic alliances. He asked her to look over a financing package that required 2 hours of unpaid labor. When she declined, he reminded her he'd put in a good word for her with a hiring manager who had never heard his name. He was careless with servers and clerks, careful with bosses, and completely unaware of the difference. Power was a place he thought he visited. He didn't understand it's something you carry quietly or not at all. He bragged about being invited to a partner's private box at a game, then left early to beat traffic and posted the view from a restaurant he liked because the lighting made his jawline look sharper. He thanked the partner publicly and forgot the name of the assistant who arranged the wristbands. He had opinions about my wardrobe that arrived disguised as concern. There's a difference between simple and careless, he'd say, as if I needed permission to wear a shirt with no logo. He insisted a man my age should invest in one good suit. I told him I'd keep investing in good people. He didn't notice that the folks who wandered in and out of my kitchen on any given weekend stayed longer than the people at his parties. The day he crossed an invisible line was a Saturday when he found me sanding a table in the shed. He stood in the doorway in a sweatshirt meant for a high-end gym and told me a craftsman as talented as I was could make real money if he stopped building heirlooms and started building a brand. He walked around the table, fingers hovering over the wood but never touching it, and pitched me a website, a logo, a tagline. I asked where the joy would go in that plan. He smiled as if joy were a feature you could toggle on once margins were healthy. He developed a habit of thanking me on Sarah's behalf. "Thanks for watching the dog last minute," he'd say, even if Sarah had asked me weeks in advance. "Thanks for the leftovers. They really helped during busy weeks," he'd add, as if the casserole were an invoice he was approving. He framed gratitude as management, which is to say he turned it into a tool and wondered why it didn't fit. When money came up, he defaulted to theater. He would tip extravagantly when people were watching and forget when the room emptied. He bought a bottle of whiskey so he could talk about the distillery and then kept it on a shelf no one was allowed to reach. He insisted that living well was a responsibility to one's future self. He skipped right past the part where living within your means is a responsibility to everyone else. There's an art to keeping the peace without surrendering the territory. I chose my battles, and mostly I chose not to have them. I listened, cooked, fixed what needed fixing, and let him narrate a life that looked excellent in photos. But I wrote things down. Comments, dates, the way he would put a hand on Sarah's back and steer her through a room without asking where she wanted to go. The way he would introduce me to his colleagues as the salt of the earth, as if I were a condiment people only notice when it's missing. When he mocked the old truck again, this time in the driveway, this time in front of 2 coworkers, I told him a man can tell himself any story he wants about horsepower until he's up against a winter road that doesn't care. He laughed and asked if that was a metaphor. I told him it was a weather report. Eventually, the jokes stopped pretending they were jokes. He'd suggest loudly that I must be exhausted keeping up, that retirement communities had pool tables now, that I deserved a break before life forced one on me. He said Sarah and he were thinking about starting a family and needed to ensure there were no extra obligations on their budget. He didn't look at me when he said obligations. He didn't have to. He bragged more loudly about his sales numbers, complained more loudly about the incompetence around him, and sighed more loudly when a server didn't immediately notice his empty glass. He wore his watch half an inch outside his cuff and rested, his arm on the table so the face caught the light. He kept insisting the promotion was a sure thing once the new owner saw his value. He didn't notice I had stopped asking about work and started asking specific questions he couldn't answer. What percentage of your region's revenue comes from renewals versus new logos? How many day sales outstanding are you carrying? Which contracts are out of compliance? He'd shrug and say that's ops, then pivot to a story about a dinner he'd hosted that got a client onto the dance floor. He believed relationships were the whole game. He didn't understand that the numbers keep score even when the band is playing. The pressure built the way it always does, quietly, under the noise. Bills come due, promises mature, facades get heavy. He tightened his jokes into judgments. I loosened my silence into planning. By the time December wrapped the town in strings of lights, he had developed a ritual of flipping his wrist toward me at the table so I could admire the watch he'd leased. And I had developed a ritual of making sure dessert forks were polished, enough to reflect a man's face back at him. He saw himself and called it success. I saw the people around him and called it a forecast. The night it snapped, he wasn't saying anything he hadn't said before. He was only saying it louder, with the confidence of a man who thinks the room is his. He set down his glass, leaned back, and announced that it was time I faced reality. He said the words the way a person says checkmate before the king is actually trapped. He believed the game ended where his patience did. He forgot whose table he was sitting at. He forgot who paid for the meal. He forgot that some men keep their stories quiet because that's where they do their best work. What he didn't know was simple. The ledger was already open. The math was already done, and the next chapter had been writing itself the whole time. He was talking. I had my attorney, James Peterson, conduct a thorough analysis of Hamilton Industries. What we found was a company in serious financial trouble, ripe for acquisition. Hamilton Industries was a family-owned business that had been struggling for years. The founder's son was running it into the ground with poor decisions and expensive mistakes. They were hemorrhaging money and desperately needed an investor. James told me, "Frank, you could buy this company for about 60% of its actual value. The current owner is so desperate, he'd probably accept any reasonable offer. But I wasn't interested in just buying the company. I wanted to understand exactly what Derek's role was there. What I discovered was that Derek wasn't the hotshot sales director he pretended to be. His sales numbers were mediocre at best, and he'd been written up multiple times for inappropriate behavior with clients and coworkers. Derek had a pattern of taking credit for other people's work, blaming his failures on his team, and treating support staff like servants. His own manager had noted in his file that Derek was arrogant and difficult to work with. But the most damaging thing I found was that Derek had been padding his expense reports for years, claiming personal meals as business expenses, inflating travel costs, even billing the company for his gym membership. It wasn't enough to get him fired, but it was enough to show his character. I realized that Derek wasn't just disrespectful to me. He was dishonest in every aspect of his life. He was a fraud who had built his entire identity on borrowed money and stolen credit. The week after that dinner, I pulled the first file from the cabinet in my study and set it next to the coffee maker. I have a rule about big decisions. Start them in small rooms with good light. A legal pad, a pencil, and a list of questions that did not care how I felt about the answers. Who owns what? Who owes whom? Where the cash actually travels when no one is giving a speech about it. I called my attorney and asked for a discreet market scan. No banners, no bankers, no press releases. He knew the drill. He formed a new holding company with a name that would blend into a list of tire shops and farm cooperatives. And he put out careful feelers to vendors, lenders, and an auditor I trust because he still double checks his own numbers. The first confirmations arrived within days. Hamilton Industries was a legacy outfit with an aging product line, a stubborn cost base, and a second-generation owner who believed culture could outrun arithmetic. It never has. We requested public records the way a man checks the fence line after a storm. Uniform commercial code filings, property tax liens, OSHA citations, environmental permits pending litigation. On paper, the company still looked sturdy enough to impress a casual passerby. Up close, the posts were leaning. A supplier dispute over late payments. A wrongful termination suit with credible witnesses. A consent order from the state over solvent handling at a satellite plant that had not been modernized. Since my daughter was in middle school, I asked for the last 5 years of financials under non-disclosure. They obliged because desperation has a habit of making even proud men cooperative. I built my own model on graph paper the way I always have, cell by cell, until the patent told the truth out loud. Revenue flat to slightly down. Gross margin narrowing as input costs climbed and list prices froze. Overhead bloated with travel and entertainment that tracked with a handful of resins, not with sales. Day sales outstanding creeping from 42 to 68, like a shadow that lengthens when no one looks. Inventory turned slowing. Backlog reported as a headline and then quietly reclassified when the promised orders slipped into the next quarter. Earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization that looked respectable in the board deck, but fell apart once the owner's personal add-backs were stripped from the footnotes. I do not buy stories. I buy cash flows and people. So I looked for the human signal in the numbers. A maintenance line item that dropped for 2 quarters and then exploded after a safety incident. A seasonal spike in overtime that coincided with the resignation of a respected plant manager. A steady climb in warranty claims from one product family that marketing kept calling legacy when they meant neglected. You can tell a lot about a company by the lines no one highlights. Then I calibrated valuation. If you assume clean books and a patient bank, you can talk yourself into paying a full multiple. If you assume covenant breaches, a tired lender, and capex overdue by a decade, the price moves the way a thermometer does at dusk. My pencil landed around 60% of what a glossy sale brochure might claim on its best day. That matched what my attorney had predicted, and it told me the seller would entertain an offer structured around speed, certainty, and grace for their family name. But numbers are only the scaffolding. I needed to know the load they were carrying. I started calling customers, not the names in the presentation deck, but the quiet accounts that renew every year because habit is easier than risk. I posed as a consultant conducting a satisfaction survey for a potential investor. Most people will tell the truth if you give them a safe way to do it. Lead times had stretched. Field reps were inconsistent. The new price list was confusing. One buyer said he missed the old sales manager who returned calls after 5. The new one always seemed to be at the airport. Another said the last lunch felt more like a fashion show than a meeting about specs. That one made a note in my margin. I drove past the main facility twice without stopping, so I could see how a shift change actually looks when folks think no one is counting. The parking lot was fuller than the payroll said it should be, and then suddenly emptier at 10 past the hour. Overtime posted on a bulletin board in the lobby with a red marker. The kind of thing HR consultants hate and unions remember. A production supervisor held the door for 3 late employees and smiled, like a man choosing mercy over policy because he could not afford to lose another trained pair of hands. I have been that man. It told me what kind of managers I could promote when the dust settled. Only then did I pull the thread with my son-in-law's name on it. I asked for anonymized dashboards by region, pipeline, close rates, average deal size, churn, mix of new business to renewals, pricing variance from list. His territory did not embarrass, but it did not lead. He lived in the middle of the pack and padded his reputation by attaching himself to legacy accounts he did not originate. Discount levels were higher than peers. Travel costs were too. He closed end of quarter with frantic sprints that smelled like concessions bled from margin, not excellence extracted from value. The trend line sloped toward average, while the expense line sloped toward entitlement. I asked for expense audits by employee without flagging any names. The controller, happy to be useful to someone who spoke her language without condescension, sent over 3 years of detail. The patterns were familiar to anyone who has looked. At enough receipts. Meals coded as client dinners that occurred the same nights as high-profile sporting events. Rideshare charges within walking distance of his apartment after 11 p.m., tagged as prospect follow-ups. A gym membership listed as wellness, which can be legitimate if the whole team participates. Here was one line item that coincided with a social media post about a new personal trainer. He was not embezzling. He was performing and billing. The house for the tickets. I always look for the counterweight to a man's reputation, so I asked to speak with the assistants. If you want to learn how a place really runs, bring coffee to the people who keep the calendars. I met one for breakfast, under the pretense of asking about scheduling software. She told me which reps prepared for meetings and which ones prepared excuses, which managers answered emails on weekends, and which managers wrote Monday morning manifestos about accountability after disappearing on Fridays. She did not trash anyone. She just told the truth in the shape of small stories. 2 of those stories featured my son-in-law sending her to fetch his dry cleaning during office hours and asking her to return a purchase he had made with a personal card and mislaid the receipt for. Neither task appeared in her job description, but they lived inside his idea of hierarchy. The founder's son agreed to a quiet lunch in a booth at a diner that serves eggs all day. He wore fatigue like a watch he could not take off. He talked about legacy, about the pressure of making payroll, about a bank that had tightened its grip as interest rates inched up. He wanted a partner with cash and patience, not a stranger with a stopwatch and a plan to gut the place. I told him in neutral phrases that discipline is not gutting, that capital expenditure is not optional when your machines are old enough to vote, that culture without competence is a potluck where everyone brings dessert. He nodded with the kind of relief that makes pride feel like a nuisance. He was ready to deal. Before committing, I commissioned a safety audit from an outside consultant I have used for 20 years. He finds the bolts people forgot to torque. He walked the floor, asked about lockout-tagout procedures, checked eye wash stations, and quietly measured the distance from a stacked pallet to a fire exit. He reported that the plant was tired but not negligent, that fixing what needed fixing would require money and attention, not scandal, just stewardship. That was the best news I heard all month. I met privately with the bank. Not the relationship manager who smiles at golf outings, the credit officer who decides whether the lights stay on. I laid out my plan to delever the balance sheet, fund deferred maintenance, and tie bonuses to inventory turns, first pass yield, and customer satisfaction instead of top-line chest thumping. He listened the way a man does when he is deciding whether to let you borrow his truck. He asked about the holding company's capital stack and my tolerance for ugly quarters while I replaced habits with systems. I told him I sleep fine during construction as long as the blueprint is right. He said the file on his desk had been waiting for someone to say those exact words. We negotiated calmly. I insisted on a clean look back at liabilities, a cap on undisclosed claims, and the right to replace certain senior managers without severance if cause existed that prior leadership had chosen to ignore. In exchange, I guaranteed a closing timeline. That would keep the doors open and payroll met, and I agreed to keep the family name on the building. That mattered to them. It also mattered to the people who have been parking in that lot for 30 years. The due diligence list grew a tail and then a shadow. IT systems that needed patching. A hodgepodge of software that could not talk to each other. a vendor contract auto-renewing at a rate that would make a sailor blush. None of it surprised me. You inherit entropy when you buy anything that has been run on improvisation and charm. I budgeted not just money, but patience. Only when the agreements were drafted did I design the part that mattered most to me. A quiet period after closing, during which the change of control would remain confidential while I conducted a management review. I wanted time to see reactions in the wild. Surprise shows people who they are. My attorney did not argue. He has seen me do my best work behind a windshield and under fluorescent lights, not on a stage. I planned the review like a field exercise. Unannounced site visits to first shift and third. A ride-along with an underperforming rep to hear what he promises and what he blames. A listening tour with supervisors performed in break rooms, not conference rooms. Anonymous pulse surveys that ask 3 questions, not 30, because the third answer tells you everything the first 2 pretend to hide. A line in the budget for coffee, pizza, and a little overtime to say thank you to the people who tell the truth first. I set one more constraint for myself. I would walk into the building dressed as I always am, with a notepad and a pocket knife, not a silk tie and a speech. If the new owner did not look like management material at first glance, that was fine with me. Power is not a costume. It is a responsibility. The people worth keeping understand the difference the instant they meet it. By the time the signatures dried, I knew what I was buying. A tired but decent company with enough good bones to carry a new roof. A set of books that needed discipline, not magic. A workforce with pride left in the tank, waiting for someone to pair it with a plan. And one man who strutted down the middle of it like he owned the soundtrack. He did not own anything but his choices. The rest would reveal itself under fluorescent lights at 3 in the afternoon. With 43 people watching and a clock on the wall that does not care who you think you are. Last Christmas, I invited Derek and Sarah over for dinner. I'd spent the day cooking Martha's traditional recipes: pot roast, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole. The same meal I'd been making for 30 years. Derek arrived an hour late, complaining about having to drive to my neighborhood in his BMW. He spent the first 20 minutes of dinner on his phone, taking what he claimed were important business calls. During dinner, Derek started talking about his plans for the new year. He was going to ask for a promotion to vice president, buy a house in the expensive part of town, maybe start a family with Sarah. Then Derek looked at me and said, "Of course, we'll have to figure out what to do about you, Frank. Sarah and I can't have kids while we're worried about supporting her broke old man. When are you going to stop embarrassing her and get a real job?" Sarah tried to defend me, but Derek cut her off. He said, "Honey, your dad's 67 years old and still working in a factory. At some point, we have to face reality. Some people just aren't meant for success." I stood up, cleared the dishes, and said, "Derek, you're absolutely right. It's time to face reality." Then I told them I had some business to take care of and they should head home. What Derek didn't realize was that he just insulted the man who was about to become his boss. The Monday after Christmas, I called James and told him to make an offer on Hamilton Industries. I said, "I want to buy that company, and I want to do it fast." James negotiated the deal over the next 2 weeks. Hamilton Industries was so desperate for cash that they accepted my offer of $12 million, about half of what the company was actually worth. But I had one specific requirement. The acquisition had to be kept confidential for 60 days while I conducted a management review of all employees. I wanted time to observe Derek in his natural habitat before he knew who his new boss was. I also insisted on reviewing all employee files, expense reports, and performance evaluations. I wanted a complete picture of Derek's behavior at work before I decided what to do with him. For the next month, I had James's investigators document Derek's daily activities at work. What they found was even worse than I'd expected. Derek was everything I'd suspected and more. He regularly showed up late, took long lunches, and spent hours on personal phone calls. He treated his assistant like a personal servant, making her pick up his dry cleaning and book his personal appointments. But the worst part was how he talked about his family, about Sarah and me. He told his co-workers that he'd married down and was stuck supporting his wife's loser father. He actually said I was dead weight that he'd have to carry for the rest of his life. After 60 days of observation, I was ready to introduce myself to my new employees. I scheduled an all-hands meeting for a Friday afternoon, telling everyone that the new owner wanted to address the company. Derek was excited about the meeting. He told Sarah that this was his chance to impress the new owner and secure that promotion he'd been wanting. He even bought a new suit for the occasion on credit, of course. I arrived at Hamilton Industries that Friday morning, dressed in my usual work clothes, flannel shirt, jeans, and work boots. The security guard almost didn't let me in because I didn't look like management material. I spent the morning walking through the offices, observing how employees interacted with each other. I watched Derek arrive 2 hours late, blame his assistant for not reminding him about an important client call, and then spend 30 minutes complaining to his co-workers about having to attend a boring meeting with some old guy who probably doesn't understand modern business. At 3 p.m., I walked into that conference room filled with 43 employees, including Derek, who was sitting in the front row checking his phone and looking bored. I stood at the front of the room and said, "Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frank Morrison, and as of 60 days ago, I'm the new owner of Hamilton Industries." Derek's head snapped up from his phone. His face went white as he realized that the broke old man he'd been insulting was now his boss. But I wasn't done yet. I continued. Over the past 2 months, I've been conducting a comprehensive review of all employees, their performance, and their conduct. I've identified several individuals who exemplify the values I want to see in this company: hard work, respect for colleagues, and integrity. I announced promotions for 5 employees who had shown exceptional character and work ethic. Derek wasn't among them. In fact, I could see him sinking lower in his chair as I spoke about the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect. Then I said, "Unfortunately, I've also identified employees whose behavior doesn't align with our company values. Individuals who have shown disrespect to colleagues, dishonesty in their expense reports, and a general attitude that success means looking down on others." I called Derek to the front of the room. He walked up slowly, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume. I handed him a folder containing copies of all his fraudulent expense reports, his poor performance reviews, and witness statements about his treatment of coworkers. I said, "Derek, you once told me that some people are meant to be workers and some are meant to be leaders. You were right. You're meant to be looking for work. You're fired." Derek tried to argue, tried to claim that I was firing him out of personal spite. But I have 43 witnesses and a folder full of evidence. Security escorted him out of the building within the hour. The other employees were shocked but not surprised. Several of them came to me afterward to thank me for finally dealing with Derek's behavior. His assistant actually cried with relief. Sarah was devastated when Derek came home and told her what happened. But when I showed her the evidence of his expense report fraud and the witness statements about how he treated people at work, she started to see who she'd really married. Derek filed for unemployment, claiming he'd been wrongfully terminated. But when the unemployment office saw the evidence of his misconduct, his claim was denied. He couldn't find another job in his field because word travels fast in our industry. Without his income, Derek couldn't maintain his lifestyle. The BMW was repossessed within 2 months. He had to move out of his expensive apartment. and back in with his parents. His credit cards went into default. Sarah filed for divorce 6 months later. She'd finally seen Derek for who he really was, not a successful businessman, but a fraud who had built his entire identity on borrowed money and stolen credit. Under my ownership, Hamilton Industries has become one of the most successful companies in the region. We've increased profits by 40%, expanded into new markets, and created a workplace culture based on respect and integrity. I promoted Derek's former assistant to sales coordinator. She's now one of our top performers and makes more money than Derek ever did. The employees who Derek used to belittle are now thriving in an environment where hard work is valued over arrogance. I still dress the same way, still drive the same truck, still live in the same modest house. But now everyone at Hamilton Industries knows that success isn't about how you look or how much you spend. It's about how you treat people and the value you create. Derek taught me an important lesson. Never judge someone by their appearance or their circumstances. The person you're looking down on might be the person who determines your future. Sarah and I have rebuilt our relationship. She's dating a teacher now, a good man who treats her with respect and appreciates her for who she is, not what she can do for his image. As for Derek, I heard he's working at a car dealership now, trying to rebuild his life. I don't wish him ill. I just hope he's learned that respect isn't something you can buy with a fancy suit and a leased BMW. People often ask me why I didn't tell Derek who I was from the beginning. The answer is simple. I wanted to see who he really was when he thought I couldn't hurt him. Character is what you do when you think nobody important is watching. I'm still the same Frank Morrison I've always been, a working man who believes in treating people with dignity and respect. The only difference is that now, when someone calls me a broke old man, I have the power to show them exactly how wrong they are. Remember, never underestimate the quiet ones. We've been watching, learning, and building power while you've been talking. And when the time comes, we know exactly how to use it.